The parking lot of the Corinth Public Library was empty at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night, except for a rusted Ford Taurus sitting under a broken light fixture, its engine ticking as it cooled in the March air. Inside the car, Eleanor Marsh sat perfectly still. Not the stillness of a woman at rest, but the stillness of a woman calculating. She was 74 years old, with silver hair she had always kept pulled back in a disciplined bun, and hands that told the truth her face refused to show. Those hands resting flat on her thighs carried the particular calluses of someone who had spent 4 decades pressing pen to paper in a windowless room. They were not the hands of a woman who had been kept. They were the hands of a woman who had kept everything together for everyone else. On the passenger seat beside her sat 2 things: a set of keys to a 10-year-old car she was already sitting in, and a check for $23,000 made out in her name in her son's handwriting because Gerald had not wanted to write it himself. Eleanor did not look at the check. She was looking at a piece of lined paper she had torn from the back of her old notebook in the conference room before anyone could see her do it. On that paper, she had been writing numbers. Not the dramatic kind of numbers that make people gasp, but the quiet, devastating kind, the kind that only means something to someone who understands how they connect. She had written the years down the left side: 1987, 1988, 1989, all the way to the present. Next to each year, she had written the approximate annual revenue of Marsh Construction Supplies from memory, because Eleanor Marsh had never needed a spreadsheet to hold numbers in her mind. They lived there the way songs live, in a musician instantly accessible, perfectly ordered. She added the column slowly, not because she needed to, but because the act of adding felt like the last honest thing she could do in this particular night. $4.2 million. That was the conservative figure. That was what had flowed through the company over 39 years. Through her hands, through her ledgers, through the tax filings she completed so precisely that not one auditor in 4 decades had found a single error. $4.2 million built on a foundation she had helped pour with her own inheritance and her own silence and her own 4:30 in the morning wake-up calls in the dark. $23,000. That was what she had been given for her share of it. She did the division. She had done it already in her head before she even left the conference room, because that is what her mind did automatically the way other people breathe. $612 per year, $51 per month, less than $2 a day for 39 years of labor that had been the actual structural spine of a business that now generated over $300,000 annually. Eleanor folded the paper in half and held it against the steering wheel. Through the library window, she could see the flickering glow of a public computer terminal, and something about that small, uncertain light in the darkness felt like the only honest thing in her field of vision. She picked up the paper again and looked at the last line she had written. She had written it before leaving the library earlier that afternoon, before the conference room, before the check in the keys in Gerald's face when he told her what she was worth. She had written it almost without thinking, her pen moving across the paper the way it always moved when her subconscious was working faster than her conscious mind. Neshoba County land payment, 22 years, who is actually paying and why. She had underlined it 3 times. She was not sure why. She was sure it mattered. Eleanor placed the paper in her coat pocket and looked up at the library window. Then she opened the car door and walked inside because she had $47 in her wallet, $23,000 in a check she had not yet cashed, and a question that had been living in the back of her mind for 2 decades. She had always been good at finding answers when the question was specific enough. Tonight, the question was finally specific. She sat down at the terminal in the back corner, the one with the screen that tilted slightly to the left, and she typed with the efficient 2-finger method she had used since 1979, when computers were something you had to explain to people rather than something that explained things to you. The Neshoba County Property Tax Database was publicly accessible. She had known that for years. She had never had a reason to look. Now she had every reason. She typed in the address coordinates she had memorized from the photocopy in her coat pocket, the one she had made 6 months ago from the survey maps she found hidden in the back of Gerald's filing cabinet, and she waited while the old terminal processed her request with the unhurried confidence of government software designed in a decade when patience was assumed. The listing appeared. 114 Whispering Cypress Lane, Philadelphia, Mississippi. Assessed value $7. Reason for assessment: catastrophic structural floor failure. Property vacant for approximately 80 years. No improvements, no utilities. Local historical designation pending no action taken. Eleanor read the listing twice. Then she opened the photocopy from her coat pocket and smoothed it flat on the table beside the keyboard. The coordinates matched perfectly. Gerald had been paying a private security firm to monitor the perimeter of this specific property for 22 years. Gerald had called it useless swampland from a bad debt settlement. Gerald had told her to pay the taxes and never mention it again. Men do not pay to protect useless things. A chair scraped against linoleum behind her. Eleanor did not turn around immediately, a habit of self-containment built over decades of working in an office where showing reaction was showing weakness. Mrs. Marsh, she turned. The man at the adjacent table was middle-aged, heavy-set in the comfortable way of someone who had been athletic once and had not entirely abandoned the posture. He was looking at her with the particular expression of someone who recognized a face from local news and was uncertain whether acknowledging it was kind or intrusive. He had a yellow legal pad in front of him, covered in handwritten notes. "Dennis Pruitt," he said, "I have a small practice over in Philadelphia. I've seen your husband's name in the business section fairly often." He paused. "Are you all right?" Eleanor had been asked that question 3 times today, by a paralegal at the conference room door who was paid to seem concerned, by a court clerk processing paperwork who was not paid to seem concerned but did it anyway, and now by this man in a library at 9 o'clock at night who appeared to have no stake in the answer whatsoever. She did not answer the question he had asked. She asked the one that was actually relevant. "Mr. Pruitt, do you know anything about historical preservation easements on private land in Neshoba County?" Dennis Pruitt looked at the screen. He looked at the photocopy smooth flat beside the keyboard. He looked at Eleanor Marsh, 74 years old, silver-haired, sitting in a library at 9 o'clock at night with the focused expression of someone who had not come here to find comfort. He said slowly and carefully, "I know the person you need to meet." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the screen, moved the cursor to the listing for 114 Whispering Cypress Lane, and clicked the button to purchase the property for $7 before she could think about it long enough to reconsider. The confirmation appeared on screen. Transaction complete. She looked at the address one more time and then closed the browser window. She had $47 in pitch on, $23,000 in a check, and a property in Neshoba County she had never seen. She did not yet know what was under its floor. But the number on the page in her pocket told her something was there, and 39 years of reading numbers had taught her to trust that instinct above all others. To understand how Eleanor got to that library on that Tuesday night, you have to go back to a humid evening in September of 1987, when she was 35 years old and still believed that intelligence was a currency that could buy a woman into a partnership. She had been the kind of woman who saw the world in structures. Not buildings, though she understood those too, but the invisible load-bearing architecture of systems. How money moved through an organization, the way blood moves through a body, along predictable pathways, with predictable pressures and with predictable failures when something in the system was misaligned. She had walked away from a full scholarship in mathematics to care for her mother through a long illness, and she had never resented that choice, not once. Her mother had been worth more than the scholarship, but the mind she would have applied to that education had not gone away. It had simply found other problems to solve. She met Gerald Warren Marsh at a town hall meeting in Corinth, where he was trying to explain to a room full of local contractors why his construction supply business was struggling. He was 50, handsome in the way of a man who had been told so often that he carried the authority of someone who expected agreement. But Eleanor, sitting in the back row with her silver pen moving across a legal pad, could see the problem in his presentation, the way you can see a structural crack in a wall if you know what load-bearing looks like. Afterwards, she walked up to him. She showed him the pad. She explained without apology and without condescension exactly where his cash flow logic was broken, where his inventory management was creating unnecessary carrying costs, and where his vendor relationships were generating leakage that a simple renegotiation would eliminate. Gerald Marsh looked at her with the expression of a man who had just been handed the map to a place he had been lost in for 3 years. They were married 6 months later. The first sacrifice came wrapped in the language of shared ambition. Gerald told her the business needed her mind more than any bank needed another vice president. He told her that everything they built would belong to both of them equally. He said the word equally as if it were a contract, as if a word spoken between two people who loved each other had the same enforceability as a document signed before witnesses and notarized. Eleanor used $15,000 of inheritance from her grandmother, money she had intended for the down payment on a small house of her own, and she bought the company's first heavy-duty delivery truck. She stood in the gravel lot behind the supply yard on a bright October morning and watched Gerald drive it away. The chrome caught the sun. She felt in that moment like someone who had just laid the cornerstone of something that would last. She would never allow herself to feel that way again. Not because the feeling was wrong, but because the feeling was too expensive to carry in a life that would require her to be precise. In the second year of their marriage, Eleanor asked Gerald once about the partnership agreement, the formal document that would establish her ownership stake in proportion to her contribution. Gerald explained that their attorney had recommended keeping everything under a single name for tax efficiency purposes, that it was standard practice for family businesses, that it would be corrected as soon as the business was on stable enough footing to justify the legal expense. Eleanor accepted this explanation. She was a reasonable woman in 1989, and she would revisit this decision in her mind 1,000 times in the decades that followed, not with the helpless regret of someone who had been too foolish to see, but with the precise analytical grief of someone who could identify exactly which variable she had incorrectly weighted. The routine she built became the heartbeat of Marsh Construction Supplies. Every morning at 4:30, she was at her desk in the office with no windows, the one at the back of the building that smelled of stale coffee and diesel and old paper. She balanced the ledgers. She filed the taxes. She managed the vendor relationships with a detailed precision that kept the company's costs consistently 10 to 15% below industry average. She negotiated twice with their primary material supplier when the supplier attempted to raise prices by amounts that would have been catastrophic to their margins. And both times she succeeded in cutting deals that Gerald later described at dinner parties as the result of his own business acumen. Gerald had the office at the front with the large windows and the leather chairs. Gerald had the long lunches with contractors and the golf days, and the handshakes and the face in the local business section. Gerald had the credit. Eleanor had the accuracy. By the 10th year of their marriage, the children had arrived and the company had grown, and Gerald had begun the process of erasure that is slow enough to be deniable and steady enough to be thorough. He stopped inviting Eleanor to the important business dinners. He began referring to the company as mine in front of friends. He told her on more than one occasion that she looked like the struggle while he needed to look like the success, and that her silver hair and sensible clothes were incompatible with the image he was curating. Eleanor stayed home in the quiet rooms of the house she had cleaned and maintained for 15 years, and she cooked meals that sometimes went cold because Gerald was out celebrating contracts. And she told herself that the invisible work is still work, that the foundation is what makes the structure stand, and that her contribution was no less real for being unacknowledged. She was not wrong about any of that, but she had failed to account for one variable. A foundation can be hidden, a face cannot. Then came the afternoon in the 20th year of their marriage when Eleanor found the anomaly. She had been reviewing the quarterly expense reports, as she did every quarter, with the methodical attention to detail that had kept the company's books clean for 2 decades, when she noticed a line item that did not connect to any active project. A monthly payment to Garrison Private Security, billed under miscellaneous operational costs, associated with an address in Neshoba County. The address matched a parcel number she had been paying property taxes on for 2 years, a parcel Gerald had acquired in what he described as a bad debt settlement, which he had told her was useless swampland, not worth developing. Eleanor was not the kind of woman who drew conclusions before she had evidence. She noted the discrepancy. She documented it. She printed the relevant pages. And then she walked down the hallway to Gerald's office with the front windows and the leather chairs, and she set the pages on his desk. Gerald did not look at the pages. He looked at Eleanor. "Did you finish the quarterly reports?" he asked. His voice was flat and even, in the particular way of a man who is controlling something he does not want her to see. "This payment doesn't correspond to anything in our active project files," Eleanor said. "It's the Neshoba parcel. You know about the Neshoba parcel. I know we're paying property taxes on it. I didn't know we were paying for private security to monitor it." The silence in the room had a different quality than ordinary silence. It was the silence of a calculation being made on the other side of the desk. "It's a liability issue," Gerald said. "The property has structural problems. We don't want anyone accessing it and getting hurt. It's standard practice for vacant land with safety hazards." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. 20 years of reading people through the numbers they kept had given her a particular sensitivity to the gap between what was said and what was meant. "All right," she said. She picked up the pages. "I'll keep the line item under miscellaneous." She walked back to her office. She made a photocopy of every relevant page before filing the originals. She put the photocopies in her own bag, not in any company folder, because something in the quality of that silence had told her clearly that this was information worth keeping somewhere Gerald could not access. She did not know why she did it. She was not yet thinking in terms of protection or strategy. She was thinking the way mathematicians think, that when a number does not fit the pattern, you preserve the anomaly, because anomalies are where the real information lives. 6 months before the divorce papers were filed, on a rainy Thursday afternoon in November, when Gerald was at a business dinner and the house was quiet, Eleanor was reorganizing the back section of the main filing cabinet in the home office. This was a task she performed every 2 years, purging outdated records and reorganizing active files, and she had done it so many times that she could navigate the cabinet by memory. The maps were in the very back behind a thick folder of equipment, insurance records, face down, as if they had been placed there by someone who did not want the face visible to a passing glance. They were old. Even before she unfolded them, she could tell that by the texture of the paper, the kind of dry, delicate weight that comes from decades of careful storage. She carried them to the desk and spread them flat under the lamp. Survey maps, hand-drawn in the precise manner of 19th century cartography, with notations in ink that had faded to a warm brown. Dated 1947, though they referenced surveys conducted earlier. Covering an area of Neshoba County that Eleanor recognized immediately because she had been paying taxes on part of it for 22 years. In the bottom right corner of the largest map, a notation in a different hand. A red wax seal partially cracked with age but still legible. An official designation. Numbers and boundaries she would need help to interpret, but which carried the unmistakable weight of something that had been formally recorded and formally protected. Eleanor stood at the desk for a long time looking at those maps. She thought about Gerald's voice in the flat and careful silence of his office 2 decades earlier. She thought about the garrison private security payments that had continued without interruption. She thought about the gap between what is said and what is meant, and about the particular kind of secret that requires 2 decades of active maintenance. Then she went to the copier in the corner of the home office, and she made complete copies of every page. She folded the originals back exactly as she had found them and returned them to their place behind the insurance folder face down undisturbed. The copies went into the bottom of her leather travel bag under the old notebooks from the 1980s that no one had touched in 30 years. She told herself she did not know why she was doing this. She was lying to herself. She knew exactly why. The morning of the conference room in Corinth, Eleanor woke at 4:30 as she had every morning for 39 years made coffee in the quiet kitchen of the house she had maintained for 4 decades, and stood at the window looking at the garden she had planted and pruned and tended while Gerald slept late on Saturday mornings. She was not sentimental about the garden. She was not sentimental about the house. She was taking an inventory. She had already been told through channels she recognized as having been carefully arranged to deny her access to independent advice that she would not be receiving legal representation at the signing. She had called 3 offices in Corinth. The first said they had a conflict of interest. The second said the matter was already resolved and they could not intervene. The third did not return her call. Eleanor had grown up in Mississippi, and she understood how telephone calls could be arranged to not be returned. She put on her good coat and her sensible shoes, and she carried the leather bag with the notebooks and the photocopied maps, and she drove to the conference room at the address Preston had sent her, and she arrived 7 minutes early because that was what she always did. Preston was in the hallway outside the conference room, speaking quietly into his phone with his back to her. The hallway had a glass partition, and Eleanor could see his reflection in it, which meant she could read his lips with reasonable accuracy, a skill he had developed over years of watching Gerald conduct business conversations he thought she could not hear. "I've made certain of it," Preston said. "She won't have representation. I've contacted every office." A pause. "Yes, it's handled." Eleanor stood at the far end of the hallway for the 3 seconds it took to complete her understanding of what she had heard. Then she walked forward at her normal pace and said good morning to her son, with the expression she had spent 39 years perfecting, the one that gave away exactly nothing. Inside the conference room, the mahogany table reflected the overhead lighting in the flat and merciless way of expensive surfaces. Gerald sat at the far end with the gold pen he had been given at a Chamber of Commerce dinner 7 years ago, and which he used for all significant signings. Diane Holbrook sat beside him, close enough to be a statement wearing a perfume that had been chosen to claim the room. Preston sat to Gerald's left in the posture of a lawyer reviewing a completed transaction. The blue folder was thin. It contained the end of 39 years. Gerald's attorney, a man Eleanor had met twice at company holiday parties, and whom she recognized as someone billing by the hour with the particular efficiency of a man who had no emotional stake in the outcome, walked her through the document in the tone of someone explaining a process to a person expected to comply with it. Separate property, no formal partnership agreement, settlement figure of $23,000 described as a gesture of good faith, keys to the 2015 Ford Taurus in the parking structure, 48 hours to vacate the family residence. Eleanor sat in the chair across from Gerald and listened to all of it with her hands folded in her lap and her face holding the expression that gave away nothing. The conference room was cold, the way expensive conference rooms are always cold, a temperature maintained for the comfort of people who generate heat through confidence. She was not cold. She was measuring. When Preston finished his explanation and slid the signature pin across the table, Eleanor looked at her son for a long moment. He did not look back. He was checking something on his phone. "Preston," she said. He looked up. "You contacted every law office in Corinth," she said. Not a question. A statement delivered in the precise tone she used when reading a figure from a ledger. The room changed. Gerald's pen stopped moving. Diane's expression shifted from its cultivated neutrality into something that involved her eyes going very slightly wider. Preston set his phone face down on the table. "This is a legal proceeding, Mother," he said. "We all want it to be concluded efficiently." "I'm sure you do," Eleanor said. She picked up the pen he had placed in front of her and signed her name on the signature line because she had already decided that the conference room was not where this particular equation would be solved. She set the pen down and pushed the folder back across the table. Gerald looked at her then, the first time he had looked directly at her face since she had entered the room. He had the expression of a man who expected to see grief and was mildly unsettled by the absence of it. "Don't look so surprised, Ellie," he said. "You spent 40 years counting my money. Did you really think you were going to get to keep any of it?" He leaned back slightly in the way of a man confirming a conclusion he had held for years. "You weren't a partner. You were just the help I happened to share a life with, and the help has outlived its usefulness." Eleanor stood up. She picked up her leather bag. She looked at Gerald across the mahogany table and she said the only thing she had planned to say, the one sentence she had prepared for this moment, with the care she once applied to opening arguments in vendor negotiations. "Gerald," she said, "you've been paying Garrison security to protect that Neshoba parcel for 22 years. I've always wondered why a man would spend that kind of money to guard something he says is worthless." She watched the shift happen behind his eyes. Something moved there, something quick and involuntary. The look of a man who realizes he has left a door open that he believed was locked. She walked to the conference room door and opened it and stepped into the hallway and kept walking. Behind her, she heard the small and celebratory sound of a champagne cork being pulled from a bottle. She did not turn around. She had already seen everything she needed to see. The 48 hours in the house were not what she had been told they would be. She arrived home that afternoon to find a courier in the driveway with a formal notice to vacate, even though she still had legal occupancy for another 2 days, and Gerald was already inside the house. It was the particular cruelty of people who have won and want to make certain the losing is fully experienced, the kind of small, vindictive precision that reveals more about character than any amount of grand gesture. She went to the guest room and began the work of deciding what mattered. The silverware from her grandmother's kitchen still in its original case. The quilts her grandmother had made by hand, each one a record of a different year of a family's life, stitched together in cotton and patience. The notebooks from 1987 through the early 90s, when her handwriting was sharper and the numbers were smaller, but the discipline was already fully formed. The leather bag with the photocopied maps inside it. She was in the process of folding the quilts when Courtney arrived. Courtney was Gerald's daughter in the way that the front office with the leather chairs was Gerald's office. She had absorbed the aesthetics of her father's world completely, the designer clothes and the social calculations, and the fundamental belief that things had value in proportion to their visibility. She walked into the guest room with the distracted efficiency of someone completing a task on a list. "Those are just old quilts, Mom," Courtney said, and she picked up the nearest one and held it at arm's length in the assessing way of someone deciding whether something was worth donating or simply disposing of. They take up storage space, and honestly, they smell like the past. We're going to need this room for Diane's linens. Eleanor set down the quilt she was holding and looked at her daughter. Put it back, she said. Courtney blinked. In 40 years of living in the Marsh household, Eleanor had accommodated and adjusted and deferred and stayed quiet so many times that the sound of a flat refusal had the quality of a foreign language. Mom, I'm trying to help you simplify. Put it back, Eleanor said again. The same tone, the tone she used when a vendor tried to walk back an agreed price. Those belong to my grandmother. They're coming with me. Courtney set the quilt down with the careful deliberateness of someone who was not agreeing, but had decided not to fight. She left the room without speaking further. Eleanor folded all 7 quilts into her second bag with the measured efficiency she brought to every packing problem, which is to say they fit perfectly. On the morning of the second day, Gerald changed the locks 3 hours before the 48-hour window expired. Eleanor came back from a short drive to find her 2 bags on the front steps, and Gerald visible through the glass of the front door, adjusting the thermostat with the focused attention of a man who had concluded his business. She sat on the steps in the March heat and waited for an hour and 40 minutes, while neighbors drove past and glanced and drove on. She was not embarrassed. She was inventorying. She had her bags. She had her grandmother's quilts and silverware. She had 39 years of ledger notebooks. She had a photocopy of a survey map from 1947 with a red wax seal in the corner. She had $23,000 cash that morning because a cash check is more useful than a piece of paper. She had enough. She put the bags in the Taurus and drove to the public library in Corinth for the second time in 2 days. And she sat at the same terminal in the back corner, and she opened the Neshoba County Property Database, and she confirmed what she had confirmed the night before. The property at 114 Whispering Cypress Lane had been purchased by one Eleanor Marsh for $7. She closed the browser. She looked at the reflection of her own face in the darkened screen for a moment. A 74-year-old woman with silver hair and a leather bag, and a question that had been living in the back of her mind for 22 years. Mrs. Marsh. Dennis Pruitt was at the same table as the night before, yellow legal pad open to a fresh page, looking at her with the expression of a man who had spent the previous 24 hours thinking about a conversation. You said you knew who I needed to meet, Eleanor said. Her name is Ruth Coldwater, Dennis said. She's a historian, Choctaw Nation. She lives about 3 miles from the Hadley property in Neshoba County. He paused. And I've been doing some reading since last night. Eleanor waited. The property you purchased, Dennis said carefully, the one with the red wax seal on those maps you were looking at, I think you should see what's on that land before anyone else does. And I think you should have someone with you who understands what they're looking at. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. The library was quiet around them in the particular way of places that hold more information than the people inside them. Can you represent me? She asked. Dennis Pruitt looked at the legal pad in front of him. He looked at the woman across the table. He thought about his small practice in Philadelphia, Mississippi, the quiet contracts and the property disputes, and the occasional estate matter that kept the lights on. And he thought about the survey maps and the red wax seal and the 22 years of security payments for a piece of land a man called Useless. Pro bono, he said. Eleanor nodded once. She picked up her bag and stood. She had not eaten since 6 o'clock that morning. She had 2 bags and a rusted Ford Taurus in the parking lot outside. She had $23,000 and a $7 deed to a property she had never seen. She walked out of the library into the cool March evening and got into the car and sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel looking at the dark road ahead of her. Somewhere in Neshoba County, 3 hours south, a cottage had been sitting empty for 80 years on land that a man had paid 2 decades of money to keep hidden. Eleanor Marsh started the engine on the first try. She drove south. The road to Philadelphia, Mississippi runs through 30 miles of longleaf pine that close over the highway like a tunnel built by something older than the state itself. Eleanor drove it in the dark, with the windows cracked, the March air carrying the particular cold of deep pine country, and the only sound was the rhythm of the road and the intermittent groan of the Taurus transmission that had been complaining since Corinth. She did not think about Gerald on that drive. She thought about the number 22. 22 years of monthly payments to a security firm, and the specific quality of Gerald's silence when she had first asked about them. She had accepted his explanation at the time because the explanation was plausible, and she had been trained by 2 decades of marriage to accept plausible explanations from a man who did not invite follow-up questions. But she was not married to him anymore, Implausible is not the same as true. She knew that better than most. The GPS signal cut out twice before she reached the county line, which was how she found herself turning onto Whispering Cypress Lane by dead reckoning, using the coordinates she had memorized from the photocopied map. The lane was unpaved, and the headlights caught the red clay of it in the pale wash of the high beams, and on either side the trees pressed close enough that the branches scraped the roof of the car in places. Then the headlights found the house. It was smaller than she had imagined and more consumed. The kudzu had been at work for decades and had covered the structure so completely that from a distance it looked less like a building than like a shape the land had decided to make a green-mounded form in the darkness, with a sagging porch that showed through the vines like a bone through skin. The windows were opaque with 80 years of accumulated grime. The roof had held, which told Eleanor something about the quality of the original construction, but the front steps had heaved upward from the soil pressure, the way steps do when the ground beneath them has been working at something. She sat in the car with the engine running for a full minute. Not because she was afraid, though she was aware that fear was a reasonable response to the situation of a 74-year-old woman alone in the dark in Neshoba County with $47 in her wallet and a $7 property she had never seen. She sat because she was doing what she always did before committing resources to an unknown situation. She was assessing. The structure was sound. The vines were a problem, but not a catastrophic one. The porch was cosmetic damage. The windows could be cleaned. The roof, judging from what the headlights showed of the visible section, was intact. And the floor. She could not see the floor from the car, but she had read the listing twice, and the phrase catastrophic structural floor failure had stayed with her not as a warning but as a data point. Structural floor failure in a building this age in this soil could mean simple rot. It could mean subsidence. It could mean something had been working against the floor from below for a very long time. Eleanor got out of the car. The mud accepted her sensible shoes with a quiet sucking sound, and she walked toward the porch with the bag over her shoulder and the key the county had emailed her as a PDF, which she had printed at the library, and which fit the padlock on the front door with the reluctant precision of metal that had not been asked to do its job in several decades. The door opened inward with a sound that was not a creak, but a protest, the full-throated objection of hinges that had forgotten what movement felt like. The air that came out was cold and still and carried three distinct layers, cedar deep and dry and clean from the walls themselves. Old paper, the particular must of documents kept in low humidity for a long time, and underneath both of those something metallic and cold that did not belong to wood or paper at all, something that came from lower down. She stood in the doorway and turned on the flashlight she had packed in the bag beside the notebooks. The living room floor stopped her. She had expected damage, warped boards, gaps, the gradual collapse of wood that had given up. What she saw instead was a floor that had been pushed. The cypress planks ran from wall to wall in the pattern of their original laying, but they had been displaced upward from whatever lay beneath them, not randomly, not in the way of rot or settling, but in a long rhythmic undulation that ran the length of the room like a wave frozen in the moment before it breaks. The planks had not failed, they had been lifted. Eleanor stood in the doorway for 30 seconds, running the geometry of it in her mind. The displacement was too uniform to be accidental. The pressure producing it was being applied from below along a consistent line, which meant the source of the pressure was not soil movement or water intrusion, but something solid and heavy arranged with deliberate spacing beneath the floor. She did not yet know what it was, but the shape of the problem was already telling her things. She was still standing there when someone knocked on the doorframe behind her. She turned. The man in the doorway was large and broad-shouldered, somewhere in his early 50s, with the particular stillness of someone who has spent time in places where stillness was survival. He was holding a flashlight of his own and a box of crackers, and he looked at her with an expression that was neither threatening nor particularly surprised, as if a 74-year-old woman with silver hair standing in the doorway of a long vacant cottage at 10 o'clock at night in Neshoba County was a situation he had considered possible. "Frank Okafor," he said, "I farm the land half a mile east. Saw your headlights and then the candle in the window." He looked past her at the living room. "Nobody's been inside here since I was a boy." "Eleanor Marsh," she said, "I bought it yesterday." Frank Okafor nodded slowly, the way a man nods when an answer confirms rather than surprises him. "I know the name," he said. "Marsh Construction. My grandfather sold gravel to your company back in the 90s. Eleanor accepted this information. You're not surprised someone bought it? No, ma'am. He looks at the floor at the long, slow rise of it in the flashlight beam. I've been waiting for the right person to come along and open that thing up. He said it the way you say a thing you have believed for a long time without knowing whether you would ever be right. Then he held out the bond of crackers. You eat anything today? Eleanor took the crackers. She could not immediately remember whether she had eaten. She did not think she had. Frank left the flashlight and the crackers and walked back into the dark without asking anything else. And Eleanor thought that a man who gives you what you need and asks nothing in return is a rarer thing than most people recognize. She ate 4 crackers in the kitchen doorway and then laid her coat on the kitchen floor and placed the leather bag beside her head like a pillow and closed her eyes. The sound of the Neshoba County night came through the walls in layers, cicadas and tree frogs and wind and pine, and beneath all of it, the silence of a house that had been waiting. The crying came in the early hours of the morning, not the kind she had refused in the conference room, not the performance of grief for an audience, but the private kind, the kind that comes when the body finally processes what the mind has been holding at operational distance for an entire day. She cried for the scholarship she had given up at 35 and never mourned properly. She cried for the 39 4:30 mornings in a windowless office. She cried because Gerald had looked at her across that mahogany table and said the words that named the thing she had been afraid was true. And the worst part was not the cruelty of the words, but the fact that he had believed them, and a man can only believe something like that about a person he has spent 40 years not seeing. She was done before the gray light began at the window cracks. Done completely the way a storm is done, the air afterward carrying a clarity that did not exist before. She sat up. She opened the leather bag and took out the 1987 ledger and held it in her hands in the dark. The weight of it was specific and familiar. She did not open it. She just held it because it was the most honest document. She owned the first one, the proof of origin, the record of what she had done before anyone had the chance to deny she had done it. Then she put it back, stood up, and began to figure out what was under the floor. The mockingbird started in the cypress tree outside at first light, and by 6 in the morning, Eleanor had the right front window open and the kitchen swept clean with a branch from the yard and a rough plan forming in her mind about what the restoration would require and in what order. She was standing on the porch drinking water from the bottle in her bag when Frank's truck came up the lane with the particular rattling confidence of a vehicle that has earned its wear. He had a handsaw and a box of nails and a thermos of coffee. He did not explain these things. He set them on the porch and went to work on the left side of the railing, which had separated from its post and was hanging at an angle that would eventually bring the whole section down. They worked without conversation for 2 hours, Eleanor clearing the front room while Frank addressed the structural issues on the exterior. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who understand that work is a language and that some things communicate better through the sound of a saw working through wood than through any arrangement of words. When Frank stopped to pour coffee from the thermos into 2 cups he had brought from his truck, he said, "You know who this house belonged to?" It was not a question. "Frances Hadley," Eleanor said. "That's what the property records show. My grandmother worked for her, cleaning and cooking from about 1940 until she disappeared." Frank handed Eleanor the cup. "My grandmother used to say Frances Hadley was the smartest woman in Neshoba County, which in 1940 was not a compliment people gave women, so she meant it seriously." Eleanor drank the coffee. It was strong and good. "What happened to her?" "October 1947. Nobody knows exactly. She was there, and then she wasn't, and what she left behind was this house and the story about the curse, which was put around by people who wanted other people to stay away from the property." Frank looked at the front of the house at the vines and the clouded windows. "My grandmother didn't believe in the curse. She believed Frances had done something with what she'd collected before she went, and she was waiting for the right person to find it." Eleanor set down the cup. "What had she collected?" "That, Frank said, is what's under the floor." He said one more thing before going back to work. Something his grandmother had told him in her last year when the old woman was still sharp enough to insist on the distinction between legend and fact. In the weeks before Frances Hadley disappeared, she had been moving things at night. Heavy things by the sound of the footsteps his grandmother heard through the floorboards. Whatever it was, she had not wanted witnesses. And whatever it was, it had been going down, not up. Eleanor turned to look at the living room floor with that information added to what she already knew, and the shape of the answer became considerably more specific. She was still carrying that shape in her mind the following morning when a different kind of visitor arrived. The car that pulled up was a late-model hybrid, clean and deliberate, and the woman who got out of it moved with the particular purposefulness of someone who had mapped the route in advance and was exactly where she had intended to be. She was perhaps 45, with the specific alertness of someone who had spent 2 decades listening to what people said when they thought they were not being recorded. "Margot Seal," the woman said, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. "Jackson Clarion Ledger, investigative desk." She looked at the cottage, at the cleared vines, at the section of repaired railing that Frank had finished the day before. "I've been following the Hadley property for 3 years. When someone bought it last week, I drove down." Eleanor looked at her from the porch. "What kind of story are you writing?" "I don't know yet. That depends on what's in there." Margot nodded toward the door. "I know Gerald Marsh has been paying to monitor this property. I know he acquired it under circumstances that never quite made sense. And I know that you bought it 48 hours after he handed you a check that should have insulted anyone who could add." "A lot of people can add," Eleanor said. "Not like you." Margot held her gaze steadily. "I've been looking at Marsh Construction's financials for 18 months. Whatever is in that building, Gerald is afraid of it, and I'd like to understand why." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was coming through the pine line at a low angle, and the cleared front wall of the cottage was catching it the way it had probably caught it in 1947 before the kudzu arrived. It was a good wall. Francis Hadley had built it to last. "There's nothing to see yet," Eleanor said. "When there is, I'll let you know." Margot looked at her for a moment, then nodded once. "I'll be at the motel in Philadelphia," she said. "Room 12. She got back in her car and drove away without pressing the point, and Eleanor noted that as the most professional thing about her. She was still thinking about the conversation when Frank came around the side of the house with a length of replacement railing on his shoulder and asked who the woman was. "A reporter," Eleanor said. "She knows about Gerald and the security payments." Frank set the railing down. "Does that bother you?" Eleanor thought about it seriously, the way she thought about most things. "No," she said finally. "But the timing matters. Everything needs to be documented first." She looked at the cottage door. "Ruth arrives tomorrow. We open the floor tomorrow." She was still carrying that larger shape in her mind 2 days after that, when the red dust cloud appeared at the far end of Whispering Cypress Lane. The truck that came out of that dust was old and dented and moved with a confidence that had nothing to do with its condition. The woman who stepped out of it was perhaps 60, with deep bronze skin and eyes that carried the particular quality of someone who has spent a professional lifetime looking at things other people have walked past without seeing. She was carrying a large thermos and over one shoulder a heavy-duty pry bar that she held the way a carpenter holds a tool, casually and with total familiarity. She looked at Eleanor on the porch and said, "You're either the most determined woman in Mississippi or the least informed." "I've been told both," Eleanor said. Ruth Coldwater was a historian employed by the Choctaw Nation and had been living 3 miles down Whispering Cypress Lane for 23 years. She had been watching the Hadley property the way you watch something you have been trained to watch, with professional patience and personal investment, and when the lights appeared in the cottage 2 nights ago, she had waited 48 hours before coming because she needed to be certain the person inside was staying. She walked into the living room and stopped when the floor came into her flashlight beam. She stood there for a long time, not analyzing, Eleanor thought, recognizing. "The earth doesn't push upward without a reason," Ruth said finally, her voice carrying the particular weight of someone stating a professional conclusion. "It moves when something below it is solid enough and heavy enough to displace what's above." Eleanor looked at the floor and saw what the county assessor had not. The displacement was not the random settling of 80 years. It had a pattern. The highest points were evenly spaced, which meant whatever was beneath them was arranged in rows. "It's not failure," she said. "It's pressure from something deliberately placed." Ruth looked at her with the focused attention of someone revising an estimate upward. "How long have you been here?" 4 days. Ruth held out the pry bar. Frank came in from the kitchen when he heard the first board lift. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and his face carrying an expression Eleanor had not seen on it before, something older than surprise, a recognition of a moment he had been told about by someone who was no longer alive to see it. The first plank came free with a sound that had been building for 80 years. The smell that followed was exact and specific red clay dampness from the Mississippi soil, the sweetness of beeswax applied in quantities that spoke of serious intent, and underneath everything a cold mineral stillness that belonged to sealed stone and sealed time. Ruth went down on one knee. Eleanor knelt on the other side of the opening, the cypress edges pressing into her, through her slacks, and she reached down into the dark, and her fingers found the surface of something that was not wood and not stone but metal cold and textured, sealed along its edges with a material that had set as hard as concrete. She needed both hands to move it. Frank stepped forward without being asked, and between the three of them, they lifted the first box into the light of the living room, and it sat there on the tilted floor, and Eleanor looked at it and understood immediately from the weight alone that what was inside was neither paper nor ordinary cargo. Ruth used the flat edge of the pry bar to chip at the sealant along the lid, while Eleanor held the box steady. The wax gave way in pieces, gray and thick, and the lid released with a sound that was less a creak than a breath, as if the box had been holding air for decades and was finally carefully letting it go. The cedar shavings inside were dry and pale and arranged with the precision of someone who understood exactly how much cushioning each object required. Ruth reached in with both hands slowly and lifted the first piece into the afternoon light that was coming through the window Eleanor had cleaned 4 days ago. It was a woman holding a child. Terracotta fired to a deep reddish brown with inlaid eyes of small river pearls that caught the light and held it. The craftsmanship was of a quality that Eleanor, who knew nothing about Choctaw ceramics and everything about the cost of precision, understood immediately as the work of someone who had been doing this for a lifetime. Ruth held it for a long time without speaking. When she finally set it down on the cleared section of floor, her hands were not entirely steady. Frances Hadley spent 20 years collecting these, Ruth said. Families were selling everything in the Depression. She bought them back and kept them. She understood what they were. She looked at Eleanor. Nobody knew where she put them. They opened 14 more boxes that afternoon. Each one held the same dry cedar shavings, the same careful arrangement, the same objects wrapped in beeswax paper and cataloged in Frances Hadley's handwriting on small cards tucked alongside each piece. Ceremonial bowls, effigy jars, burial urns, each one dated, sourced, and described in a notation system that was meticulous enough to have been designed for exactly this kind of eventual rediscovery. By the time the light began to change and they had counted what they had opened, Eleanor could do the rough math. If the remaining 20 boxes held comparable contents and the condition was consistent in the documentation Ruth was already cross-referencing against her own historical records, proved what she believed it would prove, the collection was not only historically significant, it was worth more money than Gerald Marsh had made in a decade of business. It was in the 12th box below the third layer of ceramic pieces that Eleanor found the tube. She almost missed it. The tube was the same color as the cedar shavings and was only distinguishable by its weight and its regularity, a cylinder of tin perhaps 14 inches long, sealed at both ends with the same gray wax that had sealed the lids of all the boxes. She worked the end cap free while Ruth was occupied with documenting the pieces from the 11th box, and she extracted the contents the way you extract anything fragile from a sealed container, slowly and with attention to what might break. The paper inside was old but intact, protected by the tin and the wax from the humidity that had worked on everything else in the county for 80 years. She unrolled it carefully on the section of floor she had been using as a work surface and smoothed it flat with both palms. Survey maps. Original. Hand-drawn in the tradition of 19th century land documentation, with boundaries marked in ink lines that had faded only slightly with time. Covering an area that Eleanor recognized because she had been looking at a photocopy of these same maps for 4 days. The photocopy she had taken from Gerald's filing cabinet 6 months ago. But the originals had something the photocopy had not fully captured. In the lower right corner, the red wax seal was intact and legible, and beside it in a notation that had been added in what appeared to be a different hand and a different period was a formal designation she had not been able to read clearly from the copy. It was a federal historical preservation easement, registered in 1923, covering 247 acres in Neshoba County. The boundaries drawn on the map enclosed a specific area that Eleanor had driven past, had driven through, had paid taxes on through the company accounts for 22 years without knowing its legal significance. The primary construction depot of Marsh Construction Supplies sat in the middle of it. Eleanor sat back on her heels and looked at the map and felt the particular quality of silence that comes when a very large equation resolves. Gerald had known. That was the only explanation for the security payments for the maps hidden face down in the back of the filing cabinet, for the single consultation she had found in the company records 3 years ago with a land use attorney whose bill had been routed through a sub-account she almost never reviewed. Gerald had known, and he had built his depot on protected federal land, and he had spent 2 decades making certain that the documentation proving it stayed buried in a cottage that everyone in the county was afraid to enter. She called Dennis Pruitt from the porch of the cottage as the sun was going down behind the pine line. He answered on the second ring. "The maps are here," she said, "the originals, with the federal easement notation intact." A pause. "How complete is the documentation?" "Complete enough that I can read every boundary and every notation. Complete enough that I can tell you the parcel number and the registration year." Another pause, longer this time. She could hear him writing. "Mrs. Marsh, if the easement is valid and Gerald has been operating the depot on that land with knowledge of its protected status, that is not a civil matter, that is federal exposure." "I know," Eleanor said. "And if you've been paying the preservation taxes on that land through the company accounts for 22 years, you have maintained the legal chain of custody, which means you may have standing to enforce the easement independently." "I know that too," Eleanor said. "Can you drive to Neshoba County tomorrow morning?" "I'll be there at 7, Dennis said. "And Mrs. Marsh, don't let those maps out of your possession tonight." She went back inside. Ruth was photographing the last of the open boxes by the light of 3 flashlights arranged to cover the floor. Frank had lit a small camp stove in the kitchen and was making coffee with the efficiency of a man who has decided that the night is going to be long and has planned accordingly. Eleanor sat down on the floor with the original maps spread in front of her, and she began the process of cross-referencing the boundaries against what she knew of the depot's footprint from 39 years of property tax records. The numbers she needed were in the ledgers she had carried from Corinth. She had them. She was 2/3 of the way through the comparison when her phone rang. "Unknown number, Mississippi area code." She answered. The voice was low and brief and gave her a name before anything else. It was not a name she recognized. "I work for the firm that handled Gerald Marsh's land use consultation in 2018, the voice said. "I'm telling you this on my own time and not on behalf of the firm. Gerald Marsh was informed in writing in 2018 that the Neshoba parcel carried a federal preservation easement that created significant legal exposure for his depot operations. He was advised to cease expansion plans and disclose the easement." The voice paused. "He chose to continue expansion and retain a private investigator to monitor the Hadley property instead." Eleanor held the phone and looked at the maps in front of her. "Who prepared that written advisory?" she asked. "The consultation was requested by Preston Marsh," the voice said. "He signed the engagement letter." The line went quiet. Eleanor set the phone down on the floor beside the maps. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the maps. Then she looked at the wall of the cottage, the cedar boards that Francis Hadley had built and maintained and hidden something precious inside, and then walked away from trusting that the right person would eventually arrive. Preston had known in 2018. He had not only helped erase Eleanor from the company's legal history, he had helped his father build on stolen ground and then stood in a conference room and lectured his mother about the cold logic of contracts. She was still sitting with that fact when her phone rang again 20 minutes later. This time the number was not unknown. She answered. "Mother." Preston's voice had the careful neutrality of someone who had decided in advance what register to use and was committed to it regardless of response. "I need you to understand what you're doing." Eleanor said nothing. She had learned decades ago that silence costs nothing and reveals nothing, and that the person who fills silence first usually fills it with more than they intended. "You're not just hurting the business," Preston said. "You're hurting people who work for that business, people who have families, people who had nothing to do with any decision you disagree with." A pause calibrated. "That's not who you are, or it's not who you were." "Tell me who I was," Eleanor said. The calibration held for one more sentence, then it didn't. "You were someone who understood that families require compromise, that keeping things together sometimes means accepting arrangements you don't prefer." "You mean the way I accepted an arrangement in which I received $600 a year for 39 years of work?" Silence from his end now. "Or the way I accepted being told there was no formal partnership agreement because the lawyers recommended it, when the reason there was no formal partnership agreement was that your father needed me to have no legal standing." Eleanor kept her voice level, the way she kept figures level on a balance sheet, because emotion was imprecision, and she did not have the luxury of imprecision tonight. You knew about the easement in 2018, Preston. You signed the letter, you knew what it meant, and you helped him continue anyway. And then you came to that conference room and told me that the law rewards contracts. That is privileged communication between an attorney and a client. Is it? The engagement letter has your name on it as the requesting party. You were not acting as his attorney of record. You were acting as his son, who happened to have legal training and used it to help him continue an activity that you knew exposed him to federal liability. Eleanor paused. I wonder what the Bar Association would make of that distinction. The line was quiet for long enough that she thought he might have ended the call. Then what do you want? Eleanor looked at the map spread on the floor in front of her, at the notation in a different hand, beside the red wax seal at the note she had just written at the bottom of the page. She thought about what she wanted and found the answer was not complicated. I want what Frances Hadley wanted, she said, for the right thing to be in the right hands. I don't need anything from you, Preston. I never did. She ended the call. The camp stove clicked off in the kitchen. Frank appeared in the doorway with 2 cups and set one on the floor beside Eleanor without a word. Ruth was still working in the far corner, her documentation systematic and unhurried. Eleanor picked up the cup. She looked at the maps. She thought about the 17 boxes still unopened beneath the floor and about the pages of documentation she had not yet fully read and about Dennis Pruitt driving south in the morning. She thought about Preston's voice on the phone the day before the conference room saying it is handled. She picked up the pen she had been using for the cross-referencing and added a note at the bottom of the page she was working on, a single line, a reminder to herself in a future exhibit, because she had spent 39 years keeping records that told the truth, and she was not about to stop now. She wrote Preston Marsh, 2018, signed the engagement letter. Outside, the Neshoba County night settled into its deep register of pine and dark water, and the sound of something that had been waiting a very long time finally beginning to move. The unopened boxes sat quiet in their stone cellar beneath the newly broken floor, and in the cottage that had held its secret for 80 years, 3 people worked in the lamplight, while the truth that Gerald Marsh had paid good money to keep buried arranged itself patiently and methodically into the shape of what was coming. 14 months is not a long time in the life of a county that has been accumulating history since before it had a name. But it is long enough to transform a kudzu-strangled ruin into something that causes people to slow their cars on Whispering Cypress Lane and look twice. The vines were gone. Frank had taken them down in the first month, working with the focused deliberateness of a man clearing something that should not have been allowed to grow in the first place. And what the vines revealed was cypress board construction of a quality that the current century had largely forgotten how to produce. The wood had darkened with age to a color that sat between copper and amber, depending on the time of day, and when the afternoon light came through the long leaf pines at the correct angle, it made the cottage glow in a way that had nothing to do with electricity. The porch had been rebuilt. The windows had been cleaned and in several cases replaced. The garden that had been scraggleweed and red clay was now coreopsis and purple coneflower and a row of lavender along the south fence that Ruth had planted, because she said lavender kept the mind clear, and Eleanor had not argued because in 14 months she had learned that Ruth Coldwater's practical opinions were worth more than most people's careful reasoning. Inside the living room floor that had been pushed upward by 80 years of wait and waiting was now a panel of reinforced glass set into a cedar frame, and through it you could see the stone-lined cellar below, the careful masonry that Frances Hadley had constructed with the same intent she brought to everything building, something that would last long enough for the right person to find it. The Choctaw Nation's documentation team had spent 6 weeks in that cellar. When they left, every piece had been cataloged, photographed, and assigned its place in a provenance record that was now part of the formal collection held in trust by the nation, while the repatriation process worked through its legal stages. The museum cases along the east wall held 23 representative pieces, the ones Ruth had selected as the public face of the collection, and they had been drawing scholars from 3 universities and a documentary film crew from Atlanta in the past 2 months alone. Eleanor stood at the window of what had been the kitchen and was now her office, drinking tea from her grandmother's silver pot, watching Frank replace a section of fence post in the garden below. He moved with the economy of someone who had long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone, and she had come to recognize that quality as one of the rarest things a person could carry. Dennis Pruitt's car was in the lane. He had driven up from Philadelphia at 7 that morning, as he had every Thursday for the past 6 weeks, because the legal processes set in motion by the preservation easement filing had generated paperwork at a volume that required regular attention and a lawyer willing to give that attention without billing for it. He was at the table in the front room with his yellow legal pad when Eleanor came in, and he looked up with the expression he had been wearing with increasing frequency lately, the one that meant the news was neither simple nor entirely bad. The state survey team completed their preliminary assessment of the depot site, he said. Eleanor sat down across from him and waited. They found evidence of subsurface disturbance consistent with undocumented construction activity in areas designated as protected under the easement. The Federal Preservation Office has formally requested a halt to all operations pending a full archaeological survey. Dennis set his pen down. The halt order was issued yesterday morning. Eleanor looked at the tea in her cup for a moment. 2 decades of Gerald Marsh managing his particular secret with the careful attention he had never applied to the woman who kept his books. And now a federal survey team with authority he could not negotiate away and money he could not outspend. "How long will the survey take?" she asked. "Minimum 18 months. More likely 2 to 3 years given the scope of the site." Dennis paused. "The company cannot operate without the depot, and the company cannot sustain 18 months of zero throughput from its primary facility." Another pause. "I also received a call this morning from the attorney handling the garrison security contract. They've been informed their monitoring services are no longer required." Eleanor set the cup down. "Good," she said. Dennis looked at his legal pad. "There's one more thing. Gerald's attorney called yesterday and asked whether you would consider a private settlement to avoid further proceedings. A larger figure was mentioned." He looked up. "He wanted me to tell you the number before you received any other visitors." Eleanor understood the timing immediately. Gerald knew the halt order had been issued. He knew what was coming up the lane. He was trying to buy the ending before it arrived. "What was the number?" she asked. Dennis told her. Eleanor picked up her tea. The number was significant by ordinary measures. By the measure of 39 years, it was not. "Tell his attorney that Mrs. Marsh is unavailable for settlement discussions," she said, "and that the documentation is already on file." Dennis made a note. "I thought that would be your answer," he said. "I've already confirmed receipt of the halt order with the federal office and sent copies to Ruth's contacts at the Nation." He closed the legal pad. "The remaining question is timing. They'll come today or tomorrow." "Today," Eleanor said. She looked at the window at the lane visible through the glass. "Gerald doesn't wait when he's afraid." She was still at the table an hour later when Frank appeared in the doorway of the front room with the particular quality of stillness he used when he had something to say that he had been turning over in his mind. "Vehicles coming up the lane," he said. 3 of them. Black SUVs. Eleanor did not move immediately. She looked at the maps on the table at the tea she had not finished at the window where the afternoon light was beginning its slow shift toward the amber register of late day. Then she looked at Dennis. "Are you ready?" she asked. Dennis picked up his legal pad. "I've been ready since the library," he said. Eleanor stood, smoothed her jacket, and walked to the front room where Ruth was already at the display case arranging the documentation cards with the unhurried focus of someone who understood that the arrival of certain people requires the presence of everything true. She heard the cars stop. She heard doors open and close. She heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path that Frank had laid in the 3rd month red stone from the county bed, the same red as the clay that had been under everything all along. She did not go to the door. She waited. Gerald came through it first because Gerald had always come through doors first, and the habit of precedence outlasts the authority that once justified it. He was wearing the Italian shoes and the well-cut jacket and the expression of a man who had rehearsed his entrance, and he stopped 3 steps inside the doorway in a way that was not rehearsed at all. The room was not what he had driven 3 hours to find. Museum cases with professional lighting. A glass floor revealing a stone cellar that had no business existing in a property the county had assessed at $7. Cedar walls with the warm depth of well-maintained old wood. And in the center of it all, his 74-year-old ex-wife in an emerald silk scarf, standing with the posture of someone who had not been waiting for rescue. Preston came in behind his father with the careful legal eyes that were always scanning for the structural elements of a situation, the exits and the leverage points and the procedural vulnerabilities. He looked at the glass floor, and Eleanor watched his legal mind do the work of calculating what it would take to claim what was below it, and she watched him arrive at an answer he did not like. Courtney came last phone already raised to document the experience. She lowered it almost immediately. Whatever she had expected to find at the end of that red clay lane, it was not this. Diane Holbrook was not with them. Eleanor had noticed that before she noticed anything else. Gerald moved further into the room. He looked at the display cases. He looked at the glass floor. He looked at Eleanor, and something happened in his face that was not the triumph she had seen in the conference room, and not the cold calculation she had seen in the office 20 years ago. It was something older than either of those things, something that might have been recognition, if recognition had not been so comprehensively buried under 4 decades of practiced self-regard. He began to speak in the voice he used for important rooms, the measured baritone he had spent a career calibrating for maximum credibility. He spoke about regret, about the house in Corinth feeling empty, about realizing he had been wrong to allow the divorce to proceed as it had. He used the word allow, and Eleanor noted it without expression because the choice of that word told her everything she needed to know about how much had actually changed. She let him finish. Then she said, "You didn't drive 3 hours because you missed me, Gerald. You drove 3 hours because the halt order landed on your desk yesterday morning and you finally understand what it means." Gerald stopped. "You've known about that easement since at least 2018, Eleanor said. "You built on protected land with full knowledge of its status. You paid a security firm for 22 years to make certain the documentation proving it stayed in a building that everyone in the county was afraid to enter. And you stood in a conference room 14 months ago and handed me $23,000 because you believed that was enough to make me go away." She walked to the table where the maps were spread, and she picked up the copy of the federal easement documentation, the original with the 1923 registration date, and the boundary lines that enclosed every square foot of the primary depot. "I've been paying this preservation taxes on this land since you added it to the company accounts in 2001, she said. 22 years of documented payments under my management. Dennis." Dennis stepped forward from the corner where he had been standing with the yellow legal pad and the quiet authority of a man who had done his homework completely. He set a folder on the table. "The state's preservation office confirmed yesterday that Mrs. Marsh's 22-year tax maintenance record constitutes an unbroken chain of legal stewardship. She has standing to enforce the easement as primary party of record." He looked at Preston. "The petition to classify the cottage artifacts as marital property was dismissed 4 days ago. The federal protections are not subject to state civil proceedings." Preston looked at the folder. He looked at the maps. He was doing the same calculation Gerald had been doing, working through the angles with the professional efficiency of someone who has argued in front of judges and arriving at the same conclusion his father had arrived at, which was that there were no angles left. "That documentation was obtained from private company records," Preston said. "There are questions about the chain of custody." Eleanor looked at her son, not with anger which had burned itself out somewhere in the long nights of the first month in Neshoba County, not with grief which had done the same, with something that was closer to the particular sadness of a teacher who has watched a student spend a career misusing a skill they were given in good faith. "Preston," she said, "you signed the engagement letter for the 2018 land use consultation. You knew what your father was doing and you helped him continue doing it. You then sat in a conference room and told me that the law rewards contracts and not dedication." She paused. "You were right about that, which is why I made certain I had the contracts." She nodded to Dennis. He produced a second document from the folder, a single page, and set it beside the first. 3 representatives of the Choctaw Nation's legal office stepped through the door from the back hallway where they had been waiting with the patient confidence of people who hold the stronger hand and know it. They were dressed in dark suits, and they carried themselves with the authority of a sovereign nation that had been making its case in American courts for a long time and had learned exactly how that case needed to be made. Ruth introduced them. She did it briefly and precisely the way she did everything. She explained in 2 sentences that the nation had filed formal protective status for the collection under federal statute. She explained in 1 more sentence that no civil proceeding in any state court had jurisdiction over the disposition of those objects. Courtney had stopped trying to use her phone. Gerald had sat down in the chair by the window without being invited to sit, which was so unlike him that Frank, standing in the back doorway, noticed it, and Eleanor noticed Frank noticing it and understood that it meant something. Gerald looked at Eleanor from the chair. The rehearsed expression was gone. What was underneath it was what Eleanor had suspected was underneath it for 40 years, but had never been permitted to see a tiredness so deep it had the quality of something geological, something that had been accumulating layer by layer for decades under the weight of a performance he had convinced himself was identical to the real thing. He said quietly, "I built something real." Eleanor looked at him. "No," she said. "I built something real. You put your name on it." The silence that followed was not the silence of the conference room, which had been performative and cold. This was a different kind, the silence of a true thing said in a room where there was no longer any point in arguing with it. Then Margot Seal came through the front door. She had been parked 200 meters down the lane in her hybrid with the windows down because Eleanor had told her the approximate time, and Margot had learned in 20 years of investigative journalism that approximate times were generally accurate when the source was Eleanor Marsh. She had a recorder in her jacket pocket and a folder under her arm, and she crossed the room with the purposeful stride of someone who has been waiting a long time for a story to be ready to be told. She set the folder on the table between Gerald and the maps. She said, "Mr. Marsh, my paper publishes tomorrow morning. The story covers the halt order on the depot, the federal easement violation, and the 22-year cover-up." She opened the folder to the relevant page. It also covers the $83,400 withdrawn from the secondary operating account of Marsh Construction Supplies by Diane Holbrook between 2016 and 2023. Gerald looked at the page. He looked at the bank statements Margot had obtained through channels she had not disclosed to Eleanor and would not need to. The withdrawals were there in the systematic pattern of someone who had been doing it long enough to feel safe small amounts at irregular intervals that would not trigger automatic review, adding up over 7 years to a sum that would have been immediately visible to Eleanor if she had still been managing the accounts. She had stopped managing the accounts 14 months ago. Nobody had replaced her with anyone who looked as carefully. Gerald's face did not collapse so much as it settled the way a structure settles when the last element holding a false load finally releases. He looked like what he was, a 76-year-old man sitting in a chair in a room that had been built without him, surrounded by evidence of what he had spent 4 decades failing to see. Preston said something about legal privilege and pending review and consulting with counsel before making any statements. It was professionally competent and personally hollow, and it filled the room the way air fills a space where something more substantial used to be. Courtney said nothing. She had put her phone in her bag. She was looking at the display case nearest to her, at the terracotta figure of a woman holding a child. And Eleanor could not see her daughter's face from where she stood, but she could see the angle of her shoulders, and the angle of her shoulders said something that her voice had not been ready to say in 14 months. The three of them left within 20 minutes. Not dramatically. That was the thing about real endings Eleanor had learned. They do not tend toward drama. They tend toward the quiet deflation of people who have run out of moves and know it. Gerald walked to the door with the careful step of a man who had aged 10 years and 40 minutes. Preston followed without looking back. Courtney paused at the door and turned, and for a moment she looked at Eleanor with an expression that was unguarded in a way Eleanor had not seen on her daughter's face since Courtney was a child. She did not say anything. Eleanor did not say anything, but the look passed between them like a message in a language they had both forgotten they shared, and then Courtney went out the door, and Eleanor heard the cars start and drive away down the lane, and the red clay dust rose and settled in the late afternoon light. Frank came to stand beside Eleanor at the window. They watched the dust settle together. "My grandmother told me," Frank said, "that Francis Hadley used to say a secret is only a burden if you're carrying it alone." Eleanor looked at the lane where the dust had gone still. She wasn't alone anymore, Eleanor said. She had 80 years of clay and stone holding it for her. Frank nodded. "And now it's home." The months that followed moved with the particular quality of time that has been freed from urgency. Dennis Pruitt's office handled the legal proceedings with steady competence, and the proceedings resolved with the thoroughness that tends to follow when the documentation is complete and the opposing party has run out of arguments. The halt order became permanent. The Federal Archaeological Survey of the depot site began in June, and within the first 3 weeks had identified subsurface features of sufficient historical significance to extend the protected designation to the entire parcel. Marsh Construction Supplies filed for bankruptcy protection in September. The assets were liquidated in a process that generated approximately 40 cents on the dollar for the creditors and nothing at all for Gerald, who had long since spent what the business was worth on the performance of being worth it. Diane Holbrook was arrested at the Texas border in October, discovered with $80,000 in a bag, whose lining had been modified for the purpose. She was charged in federal court and took a plea that included 18 months in full restitution, which she would be paying off for the rest of her working life. Preston's situation moved more slowly, as professional discipline cases do, but it moved. The Choctaw Nation's formal complaint to the State Bar Association detailed the 2018 consultation, the failure to disclose the conflict of interest in the subsequent effort to claim protected indigenous artifacts as marital property. The board found sufficient cause for a formal hearing. He was suspended from practice for 2 years, pending review, and the legal community in Corinth, which had known Preston Marsh as someone whose ambition exceeded his ethics without quite being able to prove it, found the outcome instructive. Dennis told Eleanor about the suspension on a Thursday morning in November, reading from a document he had received by email, and when he looked up, she was looking out the window at Frank and Ruth in the garden, and he could not tell from her expression whether she felt triumph or grief or something that had no clean name. "He's your son," Dennis said. "He made his choices," Eleanor said. "I made mine. Those are two separate facts." She paused. "Is he all right?" Dennis looked at her for a moment. "He has his health, he has his education, he has time." He set the document down. "I'd say he has more than he deserves, but then I'd have to say the same thing about a lot of people." Eleanor picked up her tea. "Fewer than you'd think," she said. Courtney came for the first time in November, appearing at the cottage gate on a Tuesday morning without calling ahead. She was wearing work clothes and her hair was back, and she was not carrying her phone in her hand, which Eleanor noted as the most significant thing about her arrival. Eleanor opened the gate and handed her a pair of gardening gloves and pointed to the lavender bed that needed clearing for winter. Courtney looked at the gloves for a moment, then she put them on. They worked in the garden for 3 hours without discussing Gerald, without discussing the conference room, without discussing the quilts. Courtney pulled weeds with the inexperienced but willing effort of someone learning that physical labor is not the same thing as humiliation, and when her hands began to show the redness of unaccustomed friction, she did not complain or stop. At noon, Eleanor made sandwiches and they ate on the porch steps in the November sun, and Courtney looked at her hands and said, "I owe you more than I know how to say." "You don't owe me words," Eleanor said. "Come back next month and we'll mulch the coneflowers." Courtney was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The quilts, I should never have touched them." Eleanor looked at her daughter's profile, at the particular quality of stillness that had replaced the phone-in-hand restlessness Courtney had carried since she was a teenager. It was the stillness of someone who had recently lost the props she had been using to avoid herself and was finding the experience both terrible and useful. "They're on the bed in the back room," Eleanor said. "You can see them before you leave if you want." Courtney nodded, not with relief, which would have been the wrong response, but with the sober acknowledgement of someone accepting a grace they understand they have not earned. They finished the sandwiches without speaking further, which was all right. Eleanor had spent 39 years in a house where silence was a form of erasure. She was learning at 77 that it could also be a form of respect. Courtney came back in December and in January, and by February she was bringing her own gloves. The Hadley Cultural Center, which was what the cottage had formally become in the autumn, when the partnership agreement with the Choctaw Nation was finalized and the nonprofit filing was approved, drew its first academic conference in the spring, a gathering of 17 scholars from 9 institutions who spent 2 days in the front room with the glass floor in the display cases, and Ruth Coldwater, who turned out to be one of the most rigorous living authorities on Choctaw material culture, and who received that recognition with the equanimity of someone who had known it for years and was simply relieved that other people had caught up. Eleanor's consulting work had grown in the way that good work grows not through advertising, but through the quality of its results. She was earning $96,000 a year, helping other communities identify and protect cultural heritage assets, work that used every skill she had developed in 39 years of financial management and applied it to something that could not be stolen by a man with a gold pen and a rehearsed expression. The Hadley Scholarship for Women Over 50 launched in the spring with 4 recipients, women who had been told in various ways and by various people that their particular combination of age and gender and interrupted history made them poor investments. Eleanor reviewed every application herself and made her decisions with the same precision she had applied to the quarterly reports, looking for the specific quality of intelligence that knows how to work without acknowledgement and has not let that silence become defeat. Frank was the center's operational director, a title he had accepted with characteristic economy, and he ran the physical maintenance and the visitor logistics and the occasional necessary confrontation with people who arrived with the wrong kind of interest in the collection. She asked him once what he was planning to do with his grandmother's story now that the thing his grandmother had been waiting for had happened. Frank thought about this for a while. "Tell it right," he said finally. "That's all she ever wanted." She asked him one more thing later that same afternoon when the light was doing what it did in October, and the garden had the particular stillness of a season deciding to turn. "Why did you come to the door that first night? You didn't know me." Frank looked at the garden for a moment. "My grandmother said that Frances Hadley told her right near the end that she was leaving everything for someone who would understand it. Not someone educated or important. Someone who'd been made to feel worthless by people who needed them." He looked at Eleanor. "I figured if the right person ever showed up, they'd be arriving at night with nothing, and the least a man could do is bring some crackers." Eleanor did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Your grandmother was a wise woman. She had a good teacher," Frank said. Margot Seal's story about the depot ran for 3 days in the Clarion Ledger and was picked up by 2 wire services. She wrote a follow-up about Frances Hadley that ran in a national magazine and was nominated for an investigative journalism award in the spring. She sent Eleanor a copy of the nomination with a handwritten note that said simply, "Your name belongs on this too." Eleanor framed the note and put it in the kitchen above the window that looked out over the lavender bed. On an afternoon in late spring, Eleanor was sitting in the garden with Ruth when a girl of perhaps 7 arrived with her grandmother for the center's weekly community education program. The girl went immediately to the replica of the woman holding child figure that sat on the low table in the front room, and she ran her finger along the edge of it with the exact focused attention of a child who has found something she recognizes without being able to say how. Ruth watched the child and said to Eleanor, "Frances would have liked this part." Eleanor looked at the child's face at the complete absorption of it. "She designed it for this part," she said. "The whole thing, every box, every seal, the whole 80 years. She was building a room where that could happen." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "So were you," she said. "You just didn't know what room you were building until you found the floor." The evening light was doing the thing it did in May, laying long gold shapes across the coreopsis that Courtney had planted in the bed along the south fence. Eleanor watched the light and thought about the number 39, not with bitterness now, but with the precise and final accounting of someone who has balanced a very long set of books and found that the figures, when properly recorded, tell a different story than the one she had been given. 39 years, $4.2 million, $23,000, and a set of car keys and a door that had been locked before the window had expired. And on the other side of all of it, a $7 deed and a floor that turned out not to be a failure, but a foundation of a different kind entirely. She went inside when the light began to go. She sat at her desk in the office that had been the kitchen in the room that smelled of cedar and her grandmother's tea and the dry, clean air of carefully preserved things. And she opened the new ledger to its first page. The ledger was the same kind she had always used. Same size, same ruled lines, same weight of paper that held ink cleanly without bleeding. What was different was the name in the top right corner, the line where for 39 years she had written Marsh Construction Supplies, with the automatic motion of a habit so old it had stopped being a choice. She wrote Hadley Cultural Center, Eleanor Marsh Director. She looked at it, then she closed the ledger and set it on the desk beside her grandmother's teapot, and she looked out the window at the garden where the last of the light was leaving the lavender. And she understood that this was what Frances Hadley had been trying to tell the person who would eventually come. Not that the clay was worth money, though it was. Not that the maps were worth fighting over, though they were. But that the act of protecting something true, of keeping it safe in the dark until the right moment, is work that does not require an audience, does not require a contract, and does not require the acknowledgement of anyone who does not deserve to give it. The mockingbird was quiet in the cypress tree. The lavender held the last warmth of the day in its stems. Outside, Neshoba County settled into its evening sounds, and in the stone cellar below the glass floor of the Hadley Cultural Center, the ceramic figures rested in the careful light, watched over by a woman who had learned at 77 what it meant to finally be working on something that was entirely her own.